Well, hello everybody, and welcome to another episode from Tolkien Guide on YouTube. I'm flying alone today, and I am really thrilled to welcome Giuseppe Pezzini, who we will call Beppe from now on, to the channel. We're going to talk today about J.R.R. Tolkien and G.B. Smith with Wind in Our Ears, which is a collection of articles or chapters on the relationship between Tolkien and Smith and their poetry and the love that they shared for it. So, welcome, Beppe.
Welcome. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's good to be here, Phil. Thank you.
You're very welcome. So, first of all, we'll have a quick catch up of what you've been up to. Now, you are in Oxford a lot of the time, which is fantastic. You've studied at St Andrews, which you describe as 5 beautiful years, which is wonderful, a lovely part of the world. You've also studied in Pisa, and you specialise in Latin. But in your spare time, shall we call it, you have a little bit of a penchant for studying Tolkien as well. So where did you start off with Tolkien and when?
Yeah, again, in a sense, I think the key word that you already mentioned is the word St. Andrews. I think like my professional interest for Tolkien developed when I was at the University of St. Andrews. Of course, I read The Lord of the Rings when I was very young, at the age of 8, in the Italian translation. And then the very first thing I did when I came to Oxford in the first place was to read it in English, which was a kind of maybe one of the other most important moments of my life. And in a way, I came to Oxford originally exactly because I wanted to follow on Tolkien's footsteps. I wanted to become a philologist. But if you are in Italy, you want to become a philologist. You don't do Anglo-Saxon philology, but you do Latin philology. That's basically why I decided to study Latin at university, and why I decided in 2006 to come to Oxford for an exchange studentship at that point. And then I stayed in England since then. But at that time, I was not really thinking of Tolkien as a professional interest. Of course, I was reading him, and in a sense, I learned English in many ways by reading The Lord of the Rings. But then when I went to St. Andrews for 5 years, there was a kind of a chance, as we call it in Middle-earth, chat with a professor at the University of St. Andrews, whose name is George Corbett, to whom I dedicated my first book, who, after a very heated conversation one evening in my place about language and beauty and philosophy of language and Tolkien, he said, I think you really should come and give a paper at the weekly seminar that he was organizing in his institute, which is called the Institute of Theology, Imagination of the Arts. So I gave my first paper there, again, almost like referring to a challenge. And then I understood that maybe the interest of the audience was a sign that I had to continue to do that. So I did. So I started to write papers one after the other, and then the seed became a sapling and then a tree, and the river became a sea, and now I'm kind of Tolkien is becoming a big part of my professional life, because apart from teaching Latin, I also one of the founders of this research center in Oxford dedicated to Tolkien studies. And so we're going to have PhD students next year. We just opened a postdoctoral fellowship in Tolkien studies in the US next year. So it's now becoming part of my professional identity in a sense, but it didn't really start like that. It's more like it's been more of a journey. And I would say the most important part of this journey was my 5 years in the University of St. Andrews, when I found a space to express my interest in a more scientific, scholarly ways.
Excellent. Was there a catalyst, a moment where you realised, I'm a Tolkien academic now? Because that's what you are. And there must have been, I imagine there must be a moment when you think, that's where the direction is now taking me. Is there a moment you can pinpoint?
Yes, I think a moment I can pinpoint is certainly when I gave my third paper, in a sense, in St. Andrews. I gave the first, it was a bit of I wouldn't say a joke, but it was a bit of an experiment. Then I gave the second, and already felt, my good, maybe this is developing to something. But then I gave the third, and the third was very well received indeed by the audience. So, and I think I remember when I gave the third paper, and at the University of St. Andrews seminar, and the room was packed, and the people in the audience were really, like, I wouldn't say in tears, but they were really moved even by the content, not by what I was saying, but what the content. My job was to introduce Tolkien to them, not really to tell them my own ideas. And I remember there was also one of my colleagues there in classics, whose name is Miles Lavan, who is a very dear friend. And I was a bit embarrassed and ashamed in the sense because I thought, oh my goodness, I'm now going to have one of my colleagues in classics who is attending this seminar. What is he going to think? But his reaction was the opposite. I mean, his reaction was very encouraging, and he basically said, look, I really think you should continue on this path. And in a sense, I did kind of follow his invitation. And that was the moment when I understood that maybe I was meant, again, I'm quoting Tolkien's words to Frodo, there was something about Tolkien scholarship that was going to be a big part of my life, while, of course, not... I mean, I still do a lot of research. My main job is still teaching classics, but I would say the two, especially in the last 2 years, my two main interests are really converging now, and I don't see any longer my Tolkien scholarship as a secret vice. In a sense, it's becoming public in a way. And the University of St. Oxford has been very gracious in embracing this interest and really turning into something big. And I really think this is going to grow in the next few years, and this is exciting.
Well, it's definitely not a sideline anymore, which brings us to your new book, or the book you edited, because the names that you've managed to bring together for this, John Garth, Grace Curry, Alonzo Killey, Dr. Stuart Lee, yourself, Mark Atherton, Chris Swank, Federica Calabrese, and Alan Turner and Ivano Sassinelli. I hope I've got some of those names correct.
Yeah.
It's a remarkable list of people to bring together. So, how did you begin to think about this new volume and who you would bring to it? Now, John Garth is a kind of an obvious choice, but some of the others may not be as well known specifically on Smith and Tolkien. So, how did you come about that process?
Yeah, I will say that so the original idea of the conference developed when I came to Oxford in 2021. So I was 5 years in London, and I came to Oxford in 2021. And when I came to Oxford, I realized that there were many people who were working on Tolkien in Oxford before I came. I mean, Mark Atherton, Stuart Lee, there was Grace Curry, who was doing her DPhil in Oxford, the very first DPhil in Oxford. There was, of course, other people like Simon Robbins. So, but at that time, Catherine Makelwain was also there, of course, at that time as the archivist of the archive. So there were many more. I mean, I could go on for with another 5-6 names at least.
Yes.
But it was not yet a sort of a space to bring these people together. So there was, in a way, they were a bit, they were doing things, but they had not done things together. And at the same time, I noticed straight away that the University of Oxford was not doing something public for Tolkien. There was still a bit of a, I wouldn't say a bias, but there still some resistance, in some quarters, especially in the English faculty and maybe in other places. There was still a kind of the traces, fading away, I must say, but still some remnants of an ancient bias against Tolkien, which of course doesn't make any sense. And maybe I sort of exploited the fact that there was a bit of an outsider because, of course, I'm originally from Italy and I was coming from the University of St. Andrews. I exploited, and it was in classics and not in English in a way. So I used this sort of freedom to kind of say, let's try to organize a conference together. And I also was a Corpus Christi College, which was G.B. Smith College. So there was a obvious connection with the very place when I was a teacher. So I thought, okay, let's try to... And the original idea actually came after an exchange of emails with Doug Anderson, who was in fact was one of the organizers of the conference in the first place. Then he was very busy, they couldn't edit the volume together with me. But I really am grateful to Doug because it was really Doug's inspiration in many ways that gave us the idea. So the people that we basically invited were either the people that were had worked on G.B. Smith, like John Garth, or Tolkien scholars who were based in Oxford that kind of had interest, especially in the First World War poetry, like Stuart Lee, who was both Stuart Lee and Grace Curry. And of course, we had Chile, who was a good friend, and also had, I mean, in a sense, the kind of knowledge that he had in terms of the biography is quite impressive. And then plus other friends that came in the way. As there were also a couple of speakers, but we decided in the end not to include the contributions. Chris Wanker was a scholar I really admire, so I really wanted to have her. And then, in a sense, it developed. It was a bit by chance, a bit by, I think that one of the big desires was to do something on Tolkien and Smith, which was academic, which was scholarly, and which was very explicitly connected with the University of Oxford. So, in a sense, that conference was the seed then of what will develop the following year into what we now call the Oxford Tolkien Network, which is this sort of community of scholars based in the University of Oxford working on Tolkien. And maybe this book is the very first fruit of that collaboration that developed back then.
That's excellent. We'll talk a little bit more about the Tolkien network later. I don't mean to single out a single chapter because all of the chapters I've read so far are fantastic, and I will say that on this subject, to open with John Garth is always a very wise move because the man is so knowledgeable and fantastic on this subject. I want to touch a little bit on Alonzo Killy's chapter. As somebody who is producing a new bibliography for our website, I'm always interested when new texts come up that I believe are Tolkien's, and I agree with Alonzo Killy's assessment there that 2 reviews that he gives in his chapter are by Tolkien. I've gone and found them myself, and I've read the full pieces now. And how was that when he came to you with that as a possibility that primary Tolkien that perhaps was not previously known was going to be included in this volume?
Yeah, that was quite exciting. I must say that at the beginning it was like this is a big claim to make, in a sense that we have, as you say, there are 2 reviews of an. We know, of course, that in many sense one of the very first publications of Tolkien was the edition of A Spring Harvest. They published a bit and bits before, but the very first substantial publication was a Spring Harvest. So in many ways, that's the very first. And so we know that's something that really Tolkien himself was very much committed. It was not just a service that was doing for one of his friends. I mean, there was something deeper behind his decision to edit A Spring Harvest. And I do still wait. We are still looking forward to the definitive edition of A Spring Harvest by Anderson, because I do think that the study of the way the Spring Harvest collection was put together is very interesting indeed, and I do really hope that in the future there will be the way to why Tolkien decided to include these particular poems, why he decided to put them in this order, what kind of thinking was behind it, and so on. But then there was very super interesting. We knew that Tolkien was very much committed to it. But then Ron Tuccilli, thanks to his amazing archival expertise and skills, he managed to find these 2 early reviews of A Spring Harvest, and the very first was published in the Times Literary Supplement, and the second instead in the Old Edwardians Gazette, known as ODG. And I mean, these 2 reviews are now printed in his chapter, so everyone. I want to apologize straight away how expensive this book is. So I would be a bit wary to say buy it, but I can say that next year or maybe a bit later than that, there will be a paperback edition. Okay, so eventually it will come up at a cheaper price, and already now for most universities it is available as an ebook. So I know I'm a bit ashamed how expensive this book is, but it was beyond my control anyway. But just to come back in talking in Alonzo Tuccilli's chapter, there is now the text of these 2 early reviews, and I do very much agree with him. At the beginning, I was quite not skeptical, but quite not, to think that we found some new original Tolkien material, and it's something that we cannot prove, so there is not 100% certainty. But I think the evidence is very, very strong. I do think that the elements that Alonzo identifies are strongly suggesting that the authorship was one of Tolkien are very, very strong. There is something personal. There is really something. There are many details, especially related to the time of the composition of one of the poems, which is called "The Southwest Wind," which is one of the reviews says it was written a still, warm summer evening. Okay, I mean, you really need to be close, very, very close to J.B. Smith to know that. But also,
yes,
in the other one, I mean, there's some kind of a very explicit references to the time when the edition was accomplished. I quote, during intervals of active services or convalescence in hospital. Again, I would be very surprised if any other, apart from Tolkien, could know these details. So I do think that we can be very grateful to Alonso for having made this big discovery. and I do strongly recommend even just getting this book one day or online to read these two reviews that in some sense sum up what the kind of collaborative dimension of Tolkien's vision of literature, which come up very clearly already in this very early text.
Absolutely. I actually emailed Aronzo myself because I found another connection or clue, if you like, within the text. In the first review that Aronzo highlights and gives, there is a connection between Tolkien's introductory note, his very short note, and the review, with the exact wording to the same mistake of the Part 3 poems all being composed during wartime. For an external reviewer to latch onto that note before the poems and use it within their review, I think is unlikely. So I do tend to agree, and I'm quite excited by the fact that I believe Aronzo has found these, and I look forward to other people hopefully assessing it as well within the community. That brings me on to I wonder what you hope for the future now that there has been this more focused study on the relationship of their poetry and their relationship as friends. What's your hope that this volume will, the impact it will have in the future on research? Do you think that Smith, for instance, should be more widely read and recognised and studied?
Yes, I mean that's a. I still think one of the chapters in this volume is by Alan Turner, and his assessment of Smith's poetry, I think, is correct and is accurate. So it is a spring harvest in all senses. So it's certainly there are many poems that are still a bit unpolished, and they still need to fully develop. But that's exactly what Smith's poetry is. It's a sort of an undeveloped seed. It's a seed that has started to blossom, but has not fully reached its full potential. So it's quite clear to me that I don't think we need to pretend that Smith's poetry has reached the full potential they could have reached if it had not been destroyed by the horror of the war. But at the same time, I do think that one can really appreciate many of the artistic seeds that we find in this poetry. And especially my favorite really poem is the last one, The Burial of Sophocles. I do really think The Burial of Sophocles is a great poem. And I do really think that it would be nice if scholars would approach it with the open eyes. And so the first thing I will say to your question is I think Smith deserves another chance, not in the sense of saying that everything was excellent, okay, but there are some kind of gems already in this collection which deserve to be found and polished. But at the same time, the other big avenue which I already mentioned, I do really hope that this volume will stir a bit of research on Tolkien's editorial work on Spring Harvest, in a sense. I really hope, I was mentioning before Doug Anderson's work. I really hope to one day to see this study, because I do think this is very interesting. But then the third area of research, which maybe is the one that I am much more interested in, the one which is also the focus of my own chapter, is how the themes that we see in Smith's poetry were fully developed in Tolkien's Imaginarium. I do really think, especially after the collection, after the publication of the collected poems, and that I really think that we still need to understand how Tolkien could claim that his first ambition was to become a poet. Why does it matter that? Why Tolkien, and of course, changing one beautiful letter that when he talks about it with his son. But I really do think that the poetic dimension of Tolkien's creativity needs still to be fully appreciated. And I do really think that this poetry of Smith can give a contribution in that respect. I think that in many sense the poetry of this form, the art, and especially the poetry of Smith and Tolkien, developed together in those years. And I really do think that in many sense Tolkien felt compelled to complete the journey, in a sense. He was the only one who managed to go on, but I don't really think that he considered himself alone in it. I do think that again, I don't want to push, but I really think that the relationship between Smith and Tolkien still needs to be fully explored. And having also the full edition of Spring Harvest, which we wanted to include in this volume, maybe can make the work a bit easier in a sense, instead of kind of going online and so on. So I really, that would be the three avenues where I still hope that will be explored in coming years.
Fantastic. You stole my next line, which was actually just to point out to people that a spring harvest is included in full. And for those who are interested in Smith's poetry, it's not just a spring harvest. There are other poems included, and that brings me back to your point in people who want to research how Tolkien edited a spring harvest. I think that some of the poems that were excluded from that volume that Tolkien clearly had access to also tells its own story, how he balanced a spring harvest, left things out that are fantastic poems throughout the book, that there are examples of Smith's other poetry that were published in journals, especially KES, the King Edward School Chronicle. So people who do buy it and are on the fence about buying it, there is a lot of information in here, not just on Tolkien, with these 2 new reviews from what we believe is from Tolkien, but also Smith's poetry not found elsewhere. And I believe that this is the first time that many of those poems have been published since they were first published, going back to 1912 in some cases. So we're well over 100 years now between publications. So this way of buying them is a much better way, regardless of the academic cost involved. So that brings me neatly really to ask you, as editor, what have you taken from the volume? What have you learned about Smith and Tolkien from these other contributors?
Yes, certainly. You already mentioned Ronzo's contribution. That was for me kind of an eye opener in many ways. I also I like very much also. I mean, all chapters add something in a way. What for me is very fascinating is how many different facets of Smith's poetic personality can be actually found, and one of the strengths I think of this volume, and it's not really my merit, but the merit of the people who wrote in it, is how many different are the possible approaches to investigate Smith's poetry. For instance, we have got Stuart Lee, who really is interested in the World War I poetry, and so he reads Smith's poetry in the context of that particular genre. And this is certainly very true. I mean, Smith's poetry, as much of Tolkien's poetry himself, is part of a much broader corpus of poems, which includes thousands and thousands of different authors, and so they really should be read within that particular context. But at the same time, they should also be read in the context of the medievalism that was quite important in the formation of both Tolkien and Smith, and that's the contribution from Chris Wonk in particular, okay, where we have the approach of the medievalist, and so we approach Smith's poetry and Tolkien's influence and derivation from it from the perspective of the medievalist. But then we got to Alan Turner's instead, where it takes yet another different approach, which is the kind of approach of the historian of English literature in the late 19th and early 20th century, and so it kind of considers Smith's poetry in the context of Tennyson's epigrams at the beginning of the century, and that's another kind of backdrop that is very important to consider when studying Smith's poetry. Then there is my own chapter, which is takes the position of the classicist, and see how also the classical tradition is important. And then we got the biographical approach, which is the one of John Garth, and also to a certain extent that of Grace Curry, and all these different approaches kind of complement each other in a way. And I think that's like what I found very enriching, as always in Tolkien scholarship, that you can really have very different standpoints and different methodologies, but all of them kind of contribute a bit like in the music of the Ainur to the understanding of the general polyphonic identity of, in this case, Smith's poetry, but more generally of Tolkien's own creative endeavor.
I like in the volume how, as I assume that you did this as an editor, the interconnection between some of the chapters. One of the contributors will touch on a subject, but they will give enough almost as an introduction, and then they will point out that Lee discusses this in far more detail in his chapter. Was there any interplay between the contributors, or was that purely an editorial process by yourself?
I would say both things together, and because first of all, these chapters developed as papers during the conference. So when we had the conference in the first place, in a way, all the different authors were kind of exposed to the contribution of the others in it. So clearly, and there were a lot of conversations during the conference, after the conference. So it's quite clear how the authors were talking to each other. Going back to the analogy of the music of the Ainu, in a way, there are different voices, but they need to listen to each other in a way. And that's why this volume started in the origin as a conference, because that's why I believe in conferences. I think the point of conference is really to kind of make people listen to each other in a sense. Then, in a way, there was my own editorial work to kind of bring this conversation together. So anyway, most of the kind of course efforts came from myself, but that because it was my job, in a sense, to create or better highlight, because they were already there, to highlight the connections between the different chapters. And again, I wouldn't say I'm error as an editor, because of course that would be a bit too much, but in a way, there is the task of the editor is really like to kind of to see. But in this case, it was quite easy because I was lucky to have that all the authors were great scholars, and so in a way, there was, to be honest, not much editorial work needed. They were the very first draft was already a very high quality.
Yeah, it shines through in the volume. So congratulations to you all on that, because it really does. As chapters by different people, the whole volume feels really well balanced. You get little introductions sometimes. You go, oh, I want to learn more of that, and you know that it's coming up, and it kind of has an almost novel pace to it in that respect. I will have to go back and read it again, because I was reading very quickly. Like, oh, I want to read about such and such, and you're tantalised by it. So well done to you all. Wonderful. So, I suppose my last real question for you is, what does the future hold for you in Tolkien scholarship?
Tolkien scholarship. So at the moment, I mean, what I'm doing at the moment, I'm working on the new movie of the Hunt for Gollum. So that's my big job at the moment, is to be the consultant for this Hunt for Gollum movie, which is, again, I cannot really reveal everything because, of course, it's still beginning, but it's quite time consuming. No, it's a big job, and because I really want to do things properly in a sense. So I'm quite humbled in a way by the desire of the scriptwriters and the director and the producers to get things right. And in a way, my contribution is to, as much as possible, to make sure that the things are Tolkienian, are accurate in a way. That my job is really to do a lot of different things, including working on language, Tolkien lore in general, but that's taking a lot of my time, but I'm enjoying so much, which I cannot complain. So I would say for the next year or so, at least, or maybe less than that, for next year, but I did the end of the year at least. I mean, I'm doing a lot of work in this respect on this Hunt for Gollum movie. Then I am big contracted to write to edit the Cambridge Companion to Tolkien, which is great. I'm very pleased. So there will be one day a Cambridge Companion to Tolkien, and I've almost finished to find all the authors of there are two names that are still unconfirmed. I hope to confirm them as soon as possible, maybe when they will have a conversation, because I do think that it's good news to have a Cambridge Companion to Tolkien, which is going to complement, of course, Stuart's Companion to Tolkien, and there will be another one from Oxford. So anyway, I do think it's very good news for Tolkien studies that in the academic world is going to is taking Tolkien so serious. It's fantastic news, and I feel we're living now in a new age. I mean, we got the first age in a sense, which was the age of the great masters, the great pioneers, Berlin Flieger, Tom Shippey, John Garth himself, Doug Anderson, many others. Now we're in a second age, if we can use this analogy, but I hope it would be better than the first, and not to use the kind of decline narrative of Tolkien. But in any case, it would be an age where I really think Tolkien will finally fully enter into academia. I think that's really what we are witnessing at the moment, and it's great. The number of students studying Tolkien, the number of people in academia working on Tolkien is going and going and going, and I think this is a very good news. And then I must say, I mostly started to put some notes together for a book on Tolkien in the classical tradition, which, in a sense, will bring together some of the things I've been researching on already. So that will be my, hopefully, next big monograph will be on Tolkien in the classics.
Sounds fantastic. We'll certainly have to have you on to talk about that. Well, thank you, Beppe. It's been wonderful to sit and talk to you about this volume. I am still reading it, but I am enjoying it very, very much. We will have a short review up on the website as soon as I finish with it. And thank you again. Those of you who don't know Beppe's work, I very much suggest his volume from last year, Tolkien and the Mystery of Literary Creation. Literary Creation. You tell them the title, Beppe.
The Tolkien and Mystery of Literature, which is a quotation from Tolkien's own letters. I mean, it is basically Tolkien's own glossing of the concept of subcreation. So what is subcreation is the mystery of literary creation.
Exactly. So yeah, all of you don't know that, go and get it. And this latest volume is out now. Thank you, Beppe.